this morning. Um, I took a little longer to get ready here this morning, so I apologize. But so I'll just go ahead and get started, get into things here. We're, of course, talking about Shobogenzo Makahanya Haramitsu. And we've started, this is our third week, I think. Let me pull my notes up here. Okay. Let's see. All right. All right, I think everything's in place now. Last time we talked about Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, and that was the main topic. This was this 2 weeks ago now, I think. So we'll continue with the next line, and it's gonna, or the next part of this line, and it's gonna include, I think, more about this, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva in our practice. Last time we said, Avalokiteshvara is practice, and Avalokiteshvara is the whole body. That's what Dogen Zenji said. And this whole body is not only our practice, but all things, in this Dharma realm support us, and we express those things in our practice. We are one with those things. Our individual practice expresses this universal reality. So we'll continue on with this line. Dogen Zenji says, the five aggregates are forms, sensations, perceptions, predilections, and consciousness. This is the fivefold prajna. So, in the Heart Sutra, which of course this is the Dogen Zenji's kind of commentary on the Heart Sutra, it says, there is no form, no sensation, no perception, no formation, no consciousness. And so this is, the Heart Sutra is saying those five skandhas, those five elements of the body and mind that we usually grasp onto and say, this is me, and that is sort of the source of all of our suffering, but it's saying, the Heart Sutra, of course, is saying that those five skandhas are empty, and that means they're impermanent and conditioned and dependent on other things. And actually, when we study the Heart Sutra, that's exactly the same thing that Shakyamuni Buddha said. If you go back to the early canon, where the Buddha presents his teaching of the five skandhas, he says exactly the same thing. That when you search each one of those, you'll get to, you won't find anything that's not changing and substantial and permanent. So this is kind of amazing here that Dogen Zenji is saying, that these five skandhas that the Buddha said are the source of all of our suffering are prajna paramita, or ultimate wisdom, ultimate reality, ultimate freedom and liberation. So, when we study the Heart Sutra, we can really kind of see how it's connected, going back to the early teachings of the Buddha. But when we read this part of Dogen Zenji's, Shobogenzo, it seems like he's really saying something opposite of what the Heart Sutra says and what the Buddha said. So, briefly, we've studied these five skandhas. The Heart Sutra talks that I gave, we studied these in a bit more detail. Just briefly, I encourage you, if you're interested in this and haven't studied them before, to study these five skandhas, because I think it's an insightful way to look at our experience as a person in the world, and to study how this self is conditioned and empty. But basically, there are five, as I say, five aggregates or five skandhas. The first one is Rupa Skandha, or form. And that basically, refers to our body. And we can say it refers to all the objects of the body too. But, the Buddha never really made a distinction in form between this body and the body that's outside of, the form that's outside of the body. So this is a kind of tricky philosophical question where you can get tripped up if you make some kind of distinction, between this body and the form of all things, so he didn't really go there. So basically form means what we consider, physical form, and it's really the body, our physical body. So, Vedanta Skandha is sensation. That means the, objects of the sense organs, the form, receive some sensation from the objects import or communicate to the body, or to the Rupa Skandha, we might say, or this body and mind receives a sensation. He talks about this kind of contact in more details in others of his teachings that we'll talk about. So with the sensation, there's some kind of interpretation or perception, samja skandha, some kind of way that we bring together a sensation or different sensations, and we form some kind of not necessarily idea, but some kind of impression that this is okay. I'm feeling wind now, or I'm seeing an object now. So then we have the next skandha is samja skandha, and that is really, this is a very interesting skandha to study, and that is basically, we usually translate that as formations or consciousness, or here it says predilections. And this is kind of the source of all of our concepts and our volition. So we bring together, the sensations and the formations. I'm sorry. It's harder to work with the translations than with the original words, but we bring together, these impressions and sensations, and we form concepts, and we have, past history from our experience. All of these things go into the sankhara, or skandha. So our volition and all of our kind of karmic ideas and predilections are there. And of course, the last skandha is vijnana, which is consciousness. And consciousness is, all of these things we could talk about for a long time, but consciousness, one way to define it is the thing that, separates things into subjects and objects, and says that I'm here and you're there, and, I need to somehow cope or manipulate this situation, or deal with this kind of reality of me versus something outside of me. So it's a kind of self-awareness, of course. And all of these skandhas, of course, are interpenetrating, and trying to find where one belongs. One begins and one ends is difficult. So it's not really our job right now. But basically, he's just talking about the body and the mind of the self, these five skandhas. So it's really amazing when, as I said, Dogen Zenji says that these skandhas are prajnaparamita, because the Buddha said that these five skandhas are the source of our suffering. So, he called these five skandhas the upadana skandhas, or the grasping skandhas. The difference here is that the grasping, of course. So the Buddha never got rid of his five skandhas. So the point here in Dogen Zenji's teaching is our relationship with those five skandhas. So Shakyamuni wouldn't have been able to teach without using his mind, and without using his body, without using his speech, without using his perceptions and sensations. He had to hear and listen to people and then respond to what they said. And he used his five skandhas to do that. If he'd gotten rid of them completely, there was no connection to him and his five skandhas, he would have been, I don't know, comatose or whatever. There would be no Shakyamuni to have given us the Dharma. And I think this is Dogen Zenji's point here. So, in the second part of the Heart Sutra, it says a bodhisattva relies on prajna paramita. So that means relying on prajna paramita means we're not relying on these five skandhas. We're not grasping. Usually what we do is we rely on these five skandhas to guide us or give us reality or give us a opinion about the world. We really believe in what we think, we grasp it. We really believe in what we feel, we grasp it and say this is truth. But in the second part, of the Heart Sutra, it says a bodhisattva relies on prajna paramita. So, what is prajna paramita? That is practice, as we said before, as we said last time. Prajna paramita is the reality of emptiness, the reality of interconnection and impermanence is one way we can talk about it in a limited relative way. But how does Avalokiteshvara, or how do we rely on that or express it or practice with it? And that is our Zazen practice. We're completely letting go of these five skandhas in our Zazen practice. Any sensation that comes up, we let go. We receive it. Any sensation that comes, we don't say, this is no good, or we have to negate it or shut it down, but we completely receive it, and yet we don't grasp it. And of course, our Zazen practice, as I often say, is the foundation for everything else that we do in our life. So it's not just for the cushion. So when we have a conversation with someone, we have to use our five skandhas. We have to think about what the person says in order to respond in a compassionate way or an appropriate way. Yet if we think our opinion is real and the other person's is unreal, and we need to fight in order to have our opinion trump the other person's opinion, that's the upadana skandha. But when we receive and offer these skandhas, that is prajna paramita. So Dogen Zenji is kind of, I think, emphasizing the more devotional part of the Heart Sutra that we usually don't remember, or we don't think of it. We kind of think of the Heart Sutra or Prajna Paramita teachings, Nagarjuna's teachings, as sort of negation and, very kind of philosophical, or everything is deconstructed. And so, and yet at the end when we read the Heart Sutra, it says a bodhisattva relies on prajnaparamita. So if we deconstruct everything, what are we relying on? So in some way, we're deconstructing, and yet this deconstruction is not the same kind of nihilistic deconstruction that we're used to hearing, or we're used to associating with, deconstruction or negation. So it was a very interesting thing about this word, rely, in the Heart Sutra, is that it also can be translated as arise, arises. So some translations of the Heart Sutra say, with nothing to attain, a bodhisattva arises from prajnaparamita. Or all Buddhas depend or rely, or all Buddhas arise from prajnaparamita. And so I think, my idea, I don't know these ancient languages, but my guess is that that person or whoever wrote this down left that word intentionally that way, so it could be interpreted both ways. It's a kind of wordplay. And Dogen Zenji, I think it's really amazing to me. So we're born again, as a bodhisattva when we practice. So a bodhisattva is born in the moment of Zazen, or a Buddha is born when we rely on prajnaparamita, and when we give up this 5 skandhas as the thing that we rely on, Avalokiteshvara is born. Or Gyobutsu, as in Gyobutsuji, the cosmic Buddha that is practice, is born. And I think this is another way that Dogen Zenji says, this is the basis of Dogen Zenji's teaching: practice and enlightenment are one. So this is his more devotional way of saying that. And the Heart Sutra actually says it too. So, we kind of think of these as 2 different approaches, or 2 different, one way is more, as I say, more philosophical, the other way is more devotional, and yet they completely interpenetrate each other. So, again, this is another way of talking about Avalokiteshvara. So when we rely on prajnaparamita, when Avalokiteshvara arises from prajnaparamita as our practice, and all suffering is released. So Avalokiteshvara is the bodhisattva of compassion, of course. So, we'll come back to this later in this text that Dogen Zenji's talking about, but, later he's very clear. He says, Prajnaparamita is itself Buddha Bhagavat. Buddha Bhagavat is itself Prajnaparamita. And what is Prajnaparamita? It's Zazen, or it's practice, or it's the reality of emptiness, which we cannot separate from practice. We cannot separate a Buddha from his practice or her practice, and the enlightenment, so to speak, or the reality that Buddha awakens to. There's no way to separate those out. That's a very deep and basic teaching of the Heart Sutra and Dogen Zenji. So I thought it was interesting to just, for example, compare some lines in the Heart Sutra with the Lotus Sutra chapter that I talked about last week, the Universal Gateway chapter of the Lotus Sutra, which we usually think of as, very devotional, but they're completely, to me, saying the same thing. So let me just remind you of this, what this sutra says in this one part that I was pointing to, from the Lotus Sutra. It says, the wondrous voice of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, Brahma voice, voice of the rolling tide, surpasses all sounds within the world. Therefore ever keep it in mind, in each thought, with never a doubt. Avalokiteshvara, the pure sage in pain, agony, or death's distress, can provide a pure support. So compare that with with nothing to attain, a bodhisattva relies on prajna paramita, and thus the mind is without hindrance. So in each thought, with never a doubt, relying in each thought, opening the hand of thought. The mind is without hindrance. Without hindrance, there is no fear. In each thought, with never a doubt, Avalokiteshvara, the pure sage, provides a pure support, as opposed to the Heart Sutra saying, the mind is without hindrance. Without hindrance, there is no fear. You're talking about Avalokiteshvara. So, the Heart Sutra says, without hindrance, there is no fear. Far beyond all inverted views, one realizes nirvana. All Buddhas of past, present, and future rely on prajna paramita, or arise from prajna paramita, and thereby attain unsurpassed, complete, perfect enlightenment. So, a bodhisattva relies on prajna paramita, to me, sounds like, therefore ever keep it in mind. Give up the 5 skandhas, your own agenda, and open the hand of thought and receive reality and make it an offering, rather than trying to navigate with these 5 skandhas as the center of our the center of our universe. Excuse me. So to me, it's kind of interesting, as I say, excuse me, this way that Dogen Zenji, excuse me, is offering up this kind of more positive, for lack of a better word, to say something about the 5 skandhas in our practice. And that's because these 5 skandhas arise from emptiness. These 5 skandhas arise from Indra's net, or all things, in the universe coming together to produce this moment. We often talk about this, how if we follow this moment and we study this moment and all the things that come together to make this moment possible, and we study it, and even if we could study it in a conventional way, including cause and effect, backwards in time, we would find the Big Bang. There's nothing here that we see before us that didn't come from infinite numbers of relationships before this moment, in time. So even, we just look at the sun or the earth and gravity and all of these things that are vital to our being able to speak in this moment. And of course, we find the immeasurable past is there in the arising, of the sun or the earth, or the way that gravity enables us to stay on on the ground here and speak. So these five skandhas are not some kind of evil thing that we have to get rid of. If we do that, we're really negating this life here and now. So what we do is we change our relationship with those five skandhas. We don't change the five skandhas. We change the relationship is the best way maybe to express it. And that means practice. That means practicing with those five skandhas rather than grasping them as truth. This is really interesting and amazing, this kind of transformation between grasping and offering. And so one way we can kind of think about it, the Heart Sutra kind of presents it in a way. I think the first part of the Heart Sutra is kind of it's illustrating or talking about the kind of great death that we talk about in Zen or many traditions, the kind of letting go of the grasping of these five skandhas as real. This person and my thoughts and my ideas about Buddhism, my ideas about the Buddha, all of those things we let go of. And when we rely on Prajnaparamita, we're reborn as a bodhisattva. On the second part, of the Heart Sutra, a bodhisattva is born from Prajnaparamita. All Buddhas of past, present, and future arise from Prajnaparamita. So, sometimes this is a little hard for us to grasp, but I'd like to, it sounds so devotional, but I want to try to relate it to other texts that say the same thing, I think. I think this is actually the earliest Prajnaparamita text, which is the Diamond Sutra. And I just want to read a little bit there from this. So the Buddha says, and how so, Subhuti, if someone should claim that the Tathagata speaks of a view of self, or that the Tathagata speaks of a view of a being, a view of a life, or a view of a soul, Subhuti, would such a claim be true? Subhuti said, no, indeed, Bhagavan. No, indeed, Sugata. Such a claim would not be true. And why not? Bhagavan, when the Tathagata speaks of a view of the self, the Tathagata speaks of it as no view. So that, he speaks of it, but he doesn't grasp it. So he speaks of it as, this says no view, but maybe we could say something beyond view. The Buddha was very clear that clinging to views was a source of suffering for us. And yet, if we don't use some view in the moment, how do we speak about the Dharma? How do we offer any compassion? So, again, Bhagavan, when the Tathagata speaks of a view of self, the Tathagata speaks of it as no view. Thus it is called view of a self. So the last line, thus it is called view of a self. When the Tathagata speaks of a view, he speaks of it as no view. Thus it is a view. So I think that means, speaking of now, from, when I'm speaking to you, I can't believe anything that I'm saying, basically. If I cling to, what I'm saying as doctrine or dogma that must be correct, that's a problem. If I speak of it as you receiving some teaching from this person, that's a problem. But if I don't have any view of myself, or I don't say, okay, I need to get out of bed this morning and give a talk, no talk happens. I have to have some view that we're moving through time and space now. But I do it in such, our practice is to do it in such a way where we're not doing this, in any element of the formula, the so-called formula. So, is what, we can go back to Genjo Koan, the first chapter of Shobo Genzo, and actually it's very much related to this Makahanya Haramitsu. Dogen Zenji placed Genjo Koan as 1 and Makahanya Haramitsu as 2 in Shobo Genzo. So in Genjo Koan it says, when all dharmas are the Buddha Dharma, there is delusion and realization, practice, life and death, Buddhas and living beings. So one way we can interpret that, there's a few ways of interpreting it. One is that this is the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha taught that there's cause and effect, and there's just delusion and enlightenment, and this is the path to awakening. The second line says, when all dharmas are not fixed self, there is no delusion and no realization, no Buddhas and no living beings, no birth and no perishing. So that is kind of, the Heart Sutra, the teaching of the Heart Sutra we usually associate with this, saying that these things don't actually exist. The things that the Buddha taught don't actually exist, and we need to be clear about that. But I think, we can also sort of interpret this as coming to practice, wanting this self is suffering. In the first, line here, this person is suffering, and we go seeking the Dharma and we find the teachings. And we usually think this person has to practice this thing and to relieve my suffering. And then we encounter, the teachings of emptiness, which the Buddha actually did teach, the emptiness of the self. And we find that this self, that we're so invested in, and the other doesn't exist. And our suffering arises from making this separation between self and other, and trying to grasp these 5 skandhas and make them supreme. And so we realize that emptiness is really the reality of our life. And yet, the number 3 line in Genjo Koan says, since the Buddha way by nature goes beyond the dichotomy of abundance and deficiency, it goes beyond the dichotomy of yes and no, of yes, things exist, or no, things don't exist. These 5 skandhas do exist or don't exist. It goes beyond the dichotomy. There is arising and perishing, delusion and realization, living beings and Buddhas. So since the Buddha way goes beyond this dichotomy of form and emptiness, there is delusion and there is enlightenment, there is just this. So that means there is this 5 skandhas, there is just the 5 skandhas, and they are empty. And we don't need to worry about saying they're empty or not, because they are empty, and yet they are form as well. And so how do we express that? That means practice. that means going beyond this dichotomy between delusion and enlightenment, yes and no, form and emptiness. Later in Dogen Zenji's commentary, he says form is just form, emptiness is emptiness. And so that means things as they are, we don't have to analyze them. We don't have to worry and say intellectually, okay, this is empty. We just need to practice. And emptiness is expressed. We don't have to worry and go onto one side or the other, because there's no way to express this reality of emptiness without form, without compassion, without speaking, without thinking, without engaging these five skandhas. So, but we change that relationship, as I said, with those five skandhas. And then when we practice, the Buddha arises, then we make an offering, that Prajnaparamita is expressed when we change our relationship. Okay. So let's see. There's one other thing maybe I wanted to say about this that I found interesting. There's a part in Makahanya Haramitsu here where it says, attending and serving all beings is itself Buddha Bhagavat. And we'll talk about that a bit later. But I think it's very interesting to think about this in terms of Shakyamuni's so-called, enlightenment, that I often bring this up, that the Buddha wasn't going to teach, after his awakening, when he understood the nature of reality, he said, no one's going to get this. And then the story goes that Indra, the king of the gods, came to him, and the king of samsara, basically, the highest being in this realm of samsara, came to him and said to him, would you please teach? There will be some people who understand this. And when he began to teach, that was the time he became a Buddha and not a Pratyeka Buddha. We recognize people, the early canon recognizes people who awaken and then don't teach anyone. And they call them a Pratyeka Buddha. But the highest awakening is of a Buddha who actually teaches. That's the highest level of awakening. And yet, Shakyamuni didn't express his Buddhahood until he started teaching, and he used his five skandhas to do that. So if he, as I said, if he had gotten rid of them, he never would have been able to walk around. He wouldn't have ever been able to walk out of to teach the five ascetics. He wouldn't have been able to go to Deer Park and say anything. Okay, so one last point about it. Another part in Genjo Koan that we see relates to this, I think, is Dogen Zenji says, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. So, forgetting the self means it sounds like another contradiction. But forgetting these five skandhas, or letting go of these five skandhas as the center of the universe, opening the hand and um, investigating this self in relationship to all beings, in relationship to this Avalokiteshvara or practice Buddha, is really studying the self in the deepest way. And he says, forgetting the self. Well, I mean, what he says, this word that says study, that is translated as study, I talk about this often too. The word actually, the kanji for it, relates to a baby bird learning to fly. And I think that means learning how to give offerings, learning how to be a bodhisattva. A human being, we fly when we make offerings. But we really reach the height of our practice, the reality of emptiness, when we make offerings, when we do our practice as offerings. And that doesn't mean that we say, oh, I don't count. Others count, but I don't count. The reality we understand is that this self is connected to all beings. And so there's no way to make an offering, a real offering, unless others and myself are all included. Or there's no way to actually practice unless all beings and all things are included. That is the reality. That's why making offerings itself is Buddha, is Buddha Bhagavat. All Buddhas arise from Prajnaparamita, making offerings. So another thing we call that is vow, living according to the Bodhisattva vow. But we could say all Buddhas arise from vow. All Bodhisattvas arise from vow or Prajnaparamita. Zazen equals Prajnaparamita equals Avalokiteshvara equals vow equals Indra's net equals all things, so forth. Okay, that's all I have to say today. So thank you for listening. And does anybody have any observations or questions or comments? Let's see, Ryushin had something?
I'm trying to organize my mind and say, but yeah.
Luck with that.
Oh, Austin wants to say something. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Try to organize my mind.
I'm sorry, I should probably put someone else in charge of figuring out who's asking the question, because I seem to get it wrong. But Austin had a question.
No, go ahead. I was just commenting on the sentence. I'm trying to organize my mind. As I said, good luck with that. I was kind of just being a little sticky. Go ahead.
Okay, you guys.
Okay, I will try.
Okay.
Like this is like not new experience for me in your lectures, and this experience has like two moments. The first moment is like, wow, this is beautiful, and it is not crazy for me. This idea that when we practice and when we rely on zazen and a bodhisattva is born, and that's also the Buddhas in all times, past, present, future, and in all directions also arise. It's like a beautiful and powerful picture, and in a sense, make sense for me. Like, yeah, that's no so uh, metaphysical thing that has nothing to do with experience. But at the same time, for me, it's like really difficult to experience that. Like Zazen, 99.9999% of the time is pain, is headaches, is many things. uh, so that's my experience. That's one my experience when I hear you, and then I was reflecting, and it's okay, the problem is grasping of the relationship that we have with uh, so I just want to share like this, like I like, yeah, like for me these kind of lectures, it's an invitation to continue studying my relationship with my grasping, and I think that it's deep, it like for me, what when I hear you, it makes sense, especially, or no, I'm sorry, I will try it again. There are some moments that I feel and I experience in a sense what you said, and it's in, sometimes in sesshin when there is like no alternatives. There is like too many things in the head that we only need to, or and something happens, and it's like wow, and in that moment it's like yeah, that it sure you sensei words makes a lot of sense. Okay, I am just making saying a lot of things, but yeah, I think that for me the key point is to keep studying my relationship with grasping. We were talking about like this, right? Grasping, and then we don't, or at least I don't usually don't uh, be aware of how my mind grasps, and that's the problem. That's why I cannot see the Buddhas of the time, 10 directions, and feel how Avalokiteshvara is born. But makes sense. It's like in, yeah, I am saying just what I said before. So maybe thank you, and I appreciate this kind of invitation to continue reflecting about uh, how I grasp without noticing. So keep working on that, and hopefully one bodhisattva or many are going to born in practice, but we'll see.
Thank you for that, Rish, and I really appreciate that. Uh, this Zazen practice and living a life based on Zazen practice isn't necessarily easy, you know. So the practice is very simple, and yet we have so many challenges in our Zazen practice. In the mind, these five skandhas rebel and say, "Why do I have to do this boring, painful, sometimes monotonous practice?" uh, so we could talk about that, but I would. One thing I wanted to say was that I think that Dogen Zenji is not talking about anything metaphysical here. So I think that's something, a point. When we say like when he says that, or when the Heart Sutra says that a bodhisattva is born from prajna paramita, that means it doesn't mean anything other than just this, here and now. And so there's kind of two perspectives to this to me. And there is a more kind of grand perspective where we can think about the whole tradition in how bodhisattvas arise cosmically and so forth, symbolically. But the real point is this moment is the bodhisattva. And when we really practice deeply, we are liberated. And, you know, all beings are liberated. That is the teaching, but it's not, you know, it's not so important to try to understand that or to believe it or whatever, you know, in the moment. But the other aspect of it is that when we, you know, in my experience, and I think in many people I've talked to, the point is to, when we change the direction of our life to making offerings rather than, you know, getting what we want, expressing our Zazen practice, that is a very meaningful shift in the direction of our life. You know, so our Zazen practice is directly related to that. Somehow we start understanding this at some point, that the way that we really walk this path is through giving up our normal kind of grasping way of saying, I have to do this. I mean, for me, I have to get my way, and I have to be successful and more successful than you, probably. That's the most important thing. But when we, you know, and that's a painful way to live, even when we're successful sometimes, even when we if we are a very talented person or whatever, we're powerful, it's sooner or later we will lose what we have. That's just the nature of life and death. Even if it's the moment before we're about to die. You know, the most powerful people in the world, you know, where are they now? Throughout the history of Genghis Khan, you know, Alexander the Great, whatever, where are they? So, but when we shift our focus from trying to get this person happy as the most important thing to walking towards our vow, you know, ironically, that's where we find our joy, you know, and happiness. And so the thing that's so difficult about our Zazen practice in relation to that is that we really, it's really hard for us to see or understand how that moment of letting go of thought, of letting go of time, really does permeate the rest of our life, you know, and really does affect this way that we walk, the way, this direction that we walk, you know, in our life. It's hard to make that connection, you know, it's really hard to make that connection with these regular, you know, 5 skandhas. But somehow this becomes easier in our everyday relationships. And we find, you know, the peace in the moment. That, but I just want to make sure that we understand that the cosmic Buddha arising is now. You know, the cosmic Avalokiteshvara, the cosmic awakening of all beings is this moment here and now. It doesn't have anything to do with some conceptual place that isn't here. You know, all of this is our life in this moment. Okay, so let's see. Austin and Lacey have their hands raised.
Yeah, I think Lacey had her hand up first, so go ahead.
Okay.
I'll just be quick. I just had a couple of comments, but I think it kind of goes along with what you were talking about too. So, one of the comments that came up for me, or the thoughts that came up for me during this was, um, it took me a little bit to figure out what you were talking about when you were saying like this was really devotional. So I just realized that I tended to think of devotional as like as a worshiping aspect or something like that. But what I think you were saying was that kind of, it was like you were just talking about with the putting it in more of, I don't know if this will be derogatory, but like a flowery language. But I don't mean it derogatory, but of calling it cosmic Buddha and stuff. And then I think you went on to talk about, so that's what you meant by devotional. But then I think you went on to talk about how, I think you were making the point that Dogen was trying to say that, you know, there's no one way of talking about this that's better than the other. And I think a point with that is some people will understand that better than other people. But you were making the comparison of where we find this teaching in other less flowery language teachings and how it all connects. The other thing that you talked about that I found really interesting and really gave me a more broader idea of what consciousness is and how we can think about that in different ways. So you had said it's like it's the thing that separates subject from object. So if we think about it in terms of that, it doesn't have to be like this thing that sits like 2 inches behind my eyes that's giving this narration of what's going on throughout the day. It can be, we can think of that also in terms of like a baby who doesn't understand yet that the mother is separate from them and so they cry when they want something, or like a person who's being abusive to somebody who's thinking like internally, they should have known I wouldn't want them to do that. Like, how stupid can they be? And like, you know, yell at them or something. So there's that unconsciousness of the person being kind of, you know, a separate person from them. So that was just a really interesting way that you put that for me. That, so if I'm wrong about that too, because I know you would say like, well, that might be like a mental formation or something too, but so that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing. I'll talk about the last thing briefly. I'll make some comments about it, but it's kind of interesting because we tend to think of you know, babies as innocent and of course beautiful and lovely and cuddly, and they are. But we wouldn't want a baby like sort of dictating our life, you know, like the decisions that we make. You know, we wouldn't want to use a baby's perspective. So in fact, you know, Ucha Moroshi had this saying like, sometimes you have to feed the baby. So we all kind of have a baby inside of us that screams when it doesn't get what we want, and it throws a tantrum when it doesn't get what it wants, and it doesn't think about the feelings of others. It only knows the reality of me. A kind of, you know, I don't know, it might be related to the kind of id of Freud, I guess, somewhat, but not, I don't think as dark and primal maybe Ucha Moroshi's saying, but if you've studied, you know, Freud, he had this view of the id, ego, and superego, which is kind of interesting. But so he said that sometimes you have to feed the baby. If it's crying so much, it's really kind of cruel if you just ignore the baby and don't feed it or give it some nourishment. So it's another way of saying we need to recognize, you know, these 5 skandhas and care for them And we don't get anywhere by pretending to be something different than we are. For example, another way of embracing the five skandhas is to say, well, actually, I had a very selfish thought then, or actually, I had a judgmental, a racist thought, or a, critical thought. And without recognizing that and accepting it, we cannot practice with it. The thought, if we just say, wait, I didn't have a judgmental thought. I'm a Buddhist. I've been practicing for 20 years. I didn't have that. The thought will keep arising again. It keeps screaming. The baby keeps crying for some nourishment. So what the baby thinks it needs is not really, the answer, but we have to, address it. But a baby, it hasn't formed any sense of separation from its mother or separation from other objects too. It's another kind of perspective. So it's another way of saying we need consciousness. We can't be driven around by a baby. It's only consciousness that allows us to study the Dharma and go beyond the baby, But it's very cruel if we just let the baby starve, That's not the way to let go of the five skandhas. I can't remember the first thing you were talking about now. Let's see, it was about devotional practice. Okay, devotional practice. So just briefly, I think, some of us seem to, it makes more sense, I think, for some people to simply, make offerings and bows to a Buddha statue. And some of us, we enter by studying the Nagarjuna. And that's the thing that attracts us, And when I first started studying, I think I was really attracted by the emptiness teachings. And once we get into that, it's, it's interesting to find the devotional part there. Like it's like maybe devotional just means opening one's heart and mind, to the moment and letting go, really. And it's funny that after some period of studying and practicing with emptiness teachings, we find this kind of devotional aspect where it is just like, okay, all beings are myself. And what can we do to honor all beings but just let go? In Shobogenzo, there's a whole chapter about making prostrations to get to the marrow of practice. Because that's from a story about Bodhidharma and the second ancestor, received Bodhidharma's transmission when he made a full prostration in answer to Bodhidharma's question about, what is the Dharma, or what is my Dharma? This very devotional act of letting go. It's actually letting go of thought with the body and mind fully present here and now, just doing it. It's a kind of leap of faith for this little mind that wants to control everything and say, it only makes sense if I figure it out. What does this mean? It only makes sense if I figure it into my little set of categories and agendas about my life. But when we study the emptiness teachings, we know that there's no way that we'll ever fit it into the agenda of reality, because it's endless and infinite. So, and the other important point is, in that chapter of Shobogenzo, Dogen Zenji said that each answer that those students gave, there were like 4 or 5 students that answered Bodhidharma, and the story goes that Huiko, or the second ancestor, was the one who got the transmission because he had the sort of best answer. But Dogen Zenji said that all of those other disciples, the ones who answered some kind of Dharma question with their mouth, or they said some other kind of philosophical answer, he said all of those were hitting the marrow. All of those were Dharma. So we can enter through the teachings of Nagarjuna, for example. It's eventually you get to just this. And when we offer a stick of incense to the Buddha statue, you're just offering incense. And so either the Buddha statue is either all Buddhas throughout space and time, or it's a toy. It's a Buddhist toy. If you just worship it as something that's going to bring you good happiness, or something that you think is cool, or a representation of something other than what's happening right now. But when we offer, to the incense, to the Buddha statue, we become one with it and everything. So that devotional aspect is another way of expressing our zazen, that offering the incense. We just offer. When we bow, we just bow. And when we are in a conversation, we just open our hearts and minds to the other person in that moment. Okay, so let's see, Austin had something.
Sorry, was muted. I was saying it kind of faded to my head a little bit at this point, but a few minutes ago when you were talking about seeking things for ourselves, and even if we get all the things that we want and become the most successful or more successful than you, most importantly, right, that all of that stuff's going to fade away. And I just had a thought that occurred to me, yeah, it's going to fade away, and that's true. But what I've often found in my own life is that that's not the only dissatisfactory part of getting what you want. That at least for me, I've had experiences where I've had this idea of I want, XYZ or whatever, and kind of go after it and get it. And it's yeah, it's going to fade away. That's true. But even in the moment that you get it, it's not as satisfactory as you think it was, as you expected it to be. The idea of that satisfaction, that some accomplishment or some material good or some relationship or some something, whatever it is, that it tends not to be that. And for me at least, zazen, taking up zazen as a practice and focusing on this letting go of thoughts and ideas, for me at least, it's helped me to sort of begin to see that and kind of short circuit that process to where I'm okay, maybe that's not where satisfaction is, because I've seen, and I have, I've seen that it's not, for me at least, in the things that I've seen. And that's just a thought that I wanted to share on that it's not just, oh, it goes away. It's even in the moment, it's not what you think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I think we've talked about it recently too, is that it's actually the pursuit of the thing rather than the thing itself that has more appeal, or that kind of sucks us in. It's really the distraction from our suffering in the moment, is another way to put it. Because once we get the thing, oh wait, it's the stuff, there's some hole that's still there. And sometimes the hole has to do with knowing that this feeling won't last forever, everything's impermanent, but also just knowing that, yeah, it didn't actually do what it was supposed to do. It didn't make everything okay. So it's a very good point. And so often what we do then is we go to the pursuit of the next thing. This thing didn't quite do it, so I'll go to that thing. And we never take the time to sit down and actually feel what we're feeling. So this is part of the power of Zazen, is to actually sit down and receive our suffering. But we don't. And that's why the five skandhas rebel, because it goes against everything it seems like is instinctual in us. We think that's instinctual, but that's a questionable. Instinctual is also to be healthy and to be awake. We have an instinct, or a drive, or whatever we want to call it, is to be healthy and awake as well. So yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. Okay, Ryushin had something.
Yeah, and it's really like short. I was reflecting about these things, like maybe like yesterday, about the problems of desire. That so we have mentioned like three. It's gonna fade away if we get it. It's gonna fade away. And sometimes when we get what we want, we were wrong about what we really want. Like we didn't know, we didn't have a clear idea about what we want. And also it's a distraction. And I just want to share another one, and it's like it takes us the opportunity to appreciate the beauty of the life, because desire has this structure of future, like trying to get something that I don't have in that moment. So that kind of a structure just don't let us appreciate the beauty of the present. So it's like it's our ordinary way of living, but it has like I don't know, like it's a big delusion or an illusion, because it has nothing to offer really. Like, and it's not only that has not on it is not only that has nothing to offer us, but it also take us important things from us, as appreciating what we really have and value what we have.
Yes, thank you for that. It's another good expression, another good way to talk about the ways that we engage in suffering. And most of all of these ways, another way we can talk about it is we, rather than just seeing this moment as our life, we compare it to something else, and so we don't actually receive what is here. So that's making comparisons about the past and future, about how things will be, in the future, when I really get what I want and this good thing is in my life. It'll be so much better than it is now. And you don't actually see the beauty that's unfolding, or the reality, or what we're feeling. We don't actually feel what we're feeling or experiencing fully in the moment, because we're caught in the future. Or we could be caught in, focusing on the past, in this kind of narrow comparison to the way things were in the past, the way they should have been, or the way they should be now. They should be better like they were in the past. I really miss that time that time was so much better. I was younger, I was better looking, whatever. I was more, whatever. I had more money, so whatever the thing might be, comparing it to now and saying how now is somehow deficient, or regretting, oh, I didn't do that. A certain amount of regret, of course, and reflection is necessary for us in our practice. But when we get stuck about something that we did and regretting, or we have a problem with suffering for ourselves and for others. When we say, when we have so many regrets, we can't really be present in the moment. We're full of sorrow or pain, or we might have attachment to something somebody said to us in the past. Boy, that was such a ridiculous statement. How could they say that to me? Clinging to this thing of how it should have been, and how, what would I say now in the moment, rather than just being here, in the moment and living our life as it is. And so in our Zazen practice, we see so many of these things coming up. And so especially like during a sesshin, or if we sit several periods for a day, and we see all these things from the past and the future arising as reality. We know they're not reality because we're just sitting in front of a wall. There's nobody telling you that you were stupid in this moment, and yet somehow somebody said that 5 years ago, and that person is still in front of you now, but it's clear there's just a wall there. There's no person talking to you. So the clarity between our imagination or our 5 skandhas, the tricks they play, and the moment arising is one of the offerings that Zazen makes to us after some time. But if we do Zazen in order to get that, it will backfire. So, if we do that in order to get better or to somehow be more insightful, we actually won't receive what's there. So, okay, so Myoho, you had something?
Yes, I'll see if my camera and it looks like everything's working. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate you commenting on how it's not about not feeling our feelings, that I think I spent the majority of the first half of my life not feeling anything. So, because, we were kind of denied our experience some of us were denied our experience from an early age. Like you felt like you wanted to cry and like stop crying, or, like I'm feeling mad. No, you're not mad. Like it's like you had this denial of being able to fully express yourself, and so then you come to this midlife, I guess, if you will, or whatever point that you figure this out, that this has been happening, and you're like, oh, like I have these feelings, and they're actually helpful because they tell me when maybe something's not okay, or something I need to do something, or like I didn't realize that I had actually completely quieted this voice, or this inner voice that was trying to desperately tell me the things that I'm needing. Like I just wasn't even paying attention to what my needs were. I was so focused on everybody else's needs. And some might think, well, that's kind of being a little selfish, isn't it? And I almost feel like women in particular are conditioned to not pay attention to what they're needing and to serve others. And so it's like this almost a shedding of this conditioning that has happened from society and from everything that's been put on us, so that we can fully claim who we are as a person, who, we have a right to be, this inner person that is unfolding and that, needs to and wants to express itself. So I was definitely a people pleaser and, missed many opportunities to actually express my feelings and what was on my mind. And now finally, I feel like I'm able to more fully express, in the moment, when I'm with someone. It doesn't have to be, not it has to be confrontational, but I think that if you have a different perspective, it's actually very important to share that perspective, because who knows what kind of thing that might, maybe that would enhance someone else's learning if you say, oh, that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I think that, let's explore what you mean by that, because then you're going to help the other person more fully understand what they're thinking and feeling, and versus just being quiet and accepting everything and that anyway. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate that piece of it. And then also the idea of, so that's kind of the knowing the self, and then the forgetting the self is like really offering and receiving skandhas. I like that, because it's like we're meeting each other and they're a set of skandhas, and we're all just offering and receiving these sense organs, and there isn't any real self in that. It's all kind of this collective thing that, and then the self can be kind of take a break and not be there. We can just kind of meet each other as we are, and not be triggered all the time. It's just these skandhas that are receiving and offering, and that giver-receiver gift thing in terms of that. So anyway, I just thank you very much. And I think the third thing, sorry, I had a lot building up. The third thing was with the Avalokiteshvara being able to arise then, so it's like, okay, to know the self and then to forget the self, understanding, fully embracing the five skandhas, but then also being able to let them go in zazen and allowing something else to arise that, you don't have control over with. And that is that inner maybe thing that we all have that we don't pay enough attention to. I don't know. But anyway, that's kind of how I took that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Melho. I really appreciate that, because it's really a good point, because we tend to think we know what compassion looks like, or what it should be, or we have some idea of what a nice person or a compassionate person or a person who makes offerings is, and then we try to do that, and we try to fit ourselves maybe into some kind of mold, rather than face ourselves and actually have some kind of genuine connection, with the moment. So we all have our strategies we kind of learned as we were kids, and some of us learned that being invisible or being small or being accommodating was the way that we got our way, or we got protected, or a way that we somehow fit into this strange world of adults. Somehow it worked. Some of us learned that we had to be domineering, that we had to be competitive, that we had to be outspoken. And sometimes these kind of strategies go along gender, or so-called gender roles, traditional gender roles often, but not always. And so when we really study those, we see that we're still carrying out that strategy as an adult. We're carrying out the strategy of a 5-year-old or something as an adult, and thinking it's still going to work. And some of us never see that this is the baby crying, or this is an outdated strategy, if we don't actually receive it and feel it and accept it, rather than saying, wait, I'm not selfish, or I'm not a bully, or whatever it might be. And the other thing is that, our strategies tend to, even if they're the most societally accepted ones that are like compromising or deferential. We tend to think of nice people as deferential. When we study ourselves, me being one of these people that was raised this way, I found how aggressive and sort of manipulating I was, and not so nice underneath. All of those ways of being nice, sometimes there's really some problem below them, that it's hard to find those things. It's hard to see that, I'm not really so nice. My whole life, you kind of map your whole life out about being this narrative of a nice person. And it's not easy to see, well, wait a minute, I'm not really so nice sometimes. And then we see that when we deny our real life force, how it comes back to bite us. So we think we're doing something nice for someone. Oh, I'm not going to tell them that I don't feel quite right about that, as you said. But then we find ourselves some other way doing something that's more painful or unskillful because of this feeling we have. So they said something that wasn't quite right to me, but I'm going to skip it because, it wasn't that big a deal. And then you find some attitude has changed towards the person, or some way that these five skandhas isn't going to let it go, even though up here you're saying you are. So we're not being so compassionate often by keeping, our strategy. It can go the other way. We think we're doing somebody a favor by telling them something very unflattering in a very direct way without any kind of thought of how it could impact them or any kind of skillful language. Or we can go the other direction, and that can be very painful for us or for others too. So it's just according to each person's kind of karmic tendencies. And I'm going on along here, but the thing that struck me though was when you were saying that, is that actually that's what the Heart Sutra is doing. Because it's saying, if you attach to all of these things of what it means to be a Buddhist without really truly seeing the deep meaning of what the Buddha was trying to say, that's delusion. So there are no five skandhas, there's no Four Noble Truths, there's no 18 elements, there's no 12-fold chain. It could, at the time, there was a time when people thought it meant, you're a good Buddhist if you can rattle off a bunch of deep philosophical jargon and defeat someone else in a debate. But that's not, not what the Buddha did. It was compassion, and it was wisdom that he imparted to other people. So it's like, have the fearlessness of the Bodhisattva to face what seems to be not compassionate if it's real. We can't just say because somebody follows the Four Noble Truths that they're a good Buddhist, or what I mean. That was kind of the point, I think, of the Heart Sutra, was to say we need to go deeper and see what the Buddha really was teaching and what he really did with his life, rather than have some narrative about what it should be, to be a Buddhist. Okay, it's late again, so maybe we should think about signing off here, unless anybody else has anything else they'd like to say before we go. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend and a good week. We won't be online next Saturday because Sesshin starts next Thursday. We'll be online for half the day each day. If you're interested in, we'll probably do a full day on Saturday too. I think I'll send out an email about that. But especially if you're interested in that, let me know, and we'll make sure that we are on for a full day on one of the days. So, okay, thank you very much, and I hope to see you again soon.